Kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. I'll request everybody to be seated, please. Okay. A very good afternoon, a very warm welcome to all the dignitaries here. Need for a clear spectrum assignment mechanism. Our session would be on need for clear spectrum assignment mechanism. Simplifying the spectrum access process improves the allocation and utilization, benefiting telecommunications, broadcasting, and other industries. This promotes growth and contributes to overall economic development by streamlining channels like the Department of Space and the Wireless Planning and Coordination, WPC. Our session will be chaired by Honorable Dr. Mahesh Uppal, Policy Expert and Director, ComFirst India Private Limited. Sir, can we have you on the stage, please? A very warm welcome. Our speakers for the session would be Ms. Laura Roberti, Director of Licensing and Market Access, Telesat Canada. Ma'am, we are privileged to have you here. Mr. Rajeev Kumar, Director, Engineering, Doordarshan, Prasar, Bharati. So, very welcome. Mr. Hazem Moakkit, VK Spectrum Strategy, Intelsat. I welcome you on the stage, sir. And last but not the least, Mr. Bashir Patel, INMARSAT, will be joining us live for the session. Hoping for a very interactive and informative session here, I'll leave the session to the chair and moderator, Dr. Mahesh. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and an honor to chair this session and to share the dais with such luminaries and experts in this space. Not just luminaries and experts, but also some of the most important players in the satellite space or in the space. And by way of context, I thought I hope you don't find it overly trivial for me to start at the beginning. We all know, for example, that spectrum is absolutely vital to any kind of wireless communications. And we also know that it is a scarce natural resource. And we do know that spectrum is required for pretty much all kinds of wireless services, ranging from obviously mobile communications, satellite communications, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, you name it. But what is interesting, however, is that the real challenge that we have had is actually been in the business of mobile spectrum, terrestrial mobile spectrum. And the interesting thing is that we actually started rather well. In the early years, when we started in the mid-90s with mobile communications, we auctioned telecom licenses, and which, as experts such as yourselves know, is a de facto auction of spectrum, right? Because all you get from a piece of paper like a license is actually just the right to use spectrum. But somewhere down the line, roughly about 7 or 8 years after that, I think we started having a whole lot of difficulties when it comes to managing a scarce resource that was required for exclusive use by mobile operators. It's quite unique in that sense that, for example, spectrum for Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or astronomy or whatever, people are not looking for exclusive use. But mobile spectrum was required in significant chunks and for exclusive use, and it made sense that it be allocated fairly in a transparent fashion and also in a way that reflected its value. But that is where I think our regulatory approach to spectrum, I think, slipped. We had difficulties. I don't know if you recall that one of the earliest problems or earliest unorthodox things we did was something called the subscriber-linked criteria. And basically what it said was that mobile operators could get free, quote-unquote, spectrum if they were to demonstrate that they had a certain number of mobile users. So this led to a huge race to acquire subscribers when operators began to give away SIM cards and all kinds of things. And you had a situation in around 2006-07 where actually you were adding literally 10 million subscribers per month, okay, in mobiles. And anybody in the business knew that that was essentially operators trying to acquire as much spectrum because the allocation was based on number of subscribers with no great check on how the subscribers were using the spectrum, or indeed whether the subscribers were unique or were they just SIM cards in somebody's drawer. And so anyway, as you're all aware, it led to a whole lot of distortions. And finally, as you're aware, we had serious controversy, serious litigation. And the Supreme Court finally decided on the matter, addressed the issues of arbitrary allocation of spectrum. However, when the Supreme Court did this, while it solved an immediate issue or problem and a very critical, urgent problem, which actually went at the roots of the way natural resources should be used, it also did a bit of an overkill. The Supreme Court judgment, in trying to solve this problem of arbitrary allocation, came up with an approach which said that the spectrum should henceforth be auctioned. All spectrum henceforth should be auctioned. The assumption was that the auction was the best way of determining, was the best way of doing allocations transparently, and also obtaining for the exchequer a rightful value for it. But I think in the process, it compounded two very different things, namely transparency and exchequer revenues. And I think there and it of course complicated the issue far beyond that, because I think while the problem, as we mentioned, was essentially limited to mobile spectrum, terrestrial mobile spectrum, it was assumed implicitly, not explicitly, implicitly, that this was a problem with all spectrum. A question about how Wi-Fi spectrum, for instance, was being shared without any issues, without any controversies, or how you and I were using Bluetooth or infrared or even visible spectrum and so on and so forth, somehow seemed to have been excluded from that consideration. So now what has happened is that's the judgment, which actually was meant to and did actually address an important problem facing us, actually have now become a a justification for further distortions. And why? Because spectrum that was typically never meant for exclusive use, that was never intended to be allocated to one player exclusively, has also somehow now been included by several stakeholders in the prescription that the Supreme Court actually made when it gave the judgment in 2012. And even though the Supreme Court did later clarify that it did not think that the auctions were a constitutional principle, it did leave some room for confusion by saying that their judgment applied only to spectrum. And again, so the whole issue of spectrum was left hanging. And of course, this has meant that whether it is public servants who want to make sure that there is nothing they do controversial, or indeed vested interests who have an interest in competitive advantage, have now, in a way, seen justification in the Supreme Court judgment. And this, of course, as you know, and you are all practitioners and people deeply involved, has led eventually, after a lot of a lot of pushing and pulling, to the DOT, the Department of Telecoms, which deals with spectrum, to ask the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, the body that makes recommendations on spectrum allocation and etc., along with, as was mentioned by the colleague here, the WPC, the Wireless Planning and Coordination Wing. So those people are the people who take these decisions, but the DOT has, in a reference to the TRAI, has asked the TRAI to recommend ways in which the satellite spectrum can be auctioned. And this, of course, raises several questions and also has implications for a large number of stakeholders, whether they are mobile players themselves, whether they are satellite communications players, whether they are satellite operators, broadcasters, and so on and so forth. And I think what we are hoping today is to, with the help of my very esteemed colleagues, to unravel both why such a step seems to have been found, has been considered, also the implications for their kind of business, and also the advantages or the risks involved in doing what seems implicitly to be asked of the TRAI in its consultation paper. As you're all aware, there is an open house also the day after tomorrow, so this discussion would be quite timely. But I think you may have noticed that I, partly because of my own background and partly because the limitations of my own knowledge, have focused largely on terrestrial communications. And I think it's very, very important to get the discussion in full perspective, and to first start with my colleague Rajeev Kumar here, who is from Doordarshan. As I mentioned earlier, that the whole issue of spectrum, both how much, what type of spectrum, how much of it can, and at what price, and in what methodology the spectrum is allocated, is of as much interest to broadcasters as it is to other players. And I was hoping first that Rajeev could broaden our perspective on this and tell us what the implications are, or what the issues are that broadcasters would be involved, would be concerned about in spectrum. My hope is that I will take very little of your time after this, and I hope that our presenters will make their initial remarks. And as you know, we have some of the best experts. We have Roberti from Telesat, we have Hazem from Intelsat, and we have Bashir Patel from INMARSAT. Sorry, my apologies, Bashir, if you're listening. My deepest apologies. And of course, Rajeev. So with that, I'm going to request Rajeev to please set the ball rolling and take a few minutes to explain what the issues are from a broadcaster's perspective. And then I'll go to Laura and Hazem and Bashir. And if any of them have preferences in sequencing. Yeah? Okay. Well. Are you on?
Thank you, Chair.
Rajeev ji, thank you. Rajeev is from Doordarshan and has been there for a good 20 years, I think, and is also from IIT Roorkee. Please.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like also thank SIA to invite me to this conference and giving chance to speak here. Audience is quite august gathering basically and very learned. I am Rajeev Kumar, Director Engineering with Doordarshan, which is part of Prasar Bharati, which has two verticals. One is Doordarshan, which provides TV services to the country people, and at the same time we have global presence. We have Gigi India channel, which is news channel in English, and that is available in many of the countries through various distribution platforms. Currently, Doordarshan is having 36 channels, and it has a number of studios, transmitters, and uplink stations, DSNGs, OB bands, to cover and cater to the need of broadcasting and to the people of India. And we have a DTH platform as well that has 116 TV channels, 50 educational TV channels, and around 40 radio channels. And those radio channels have our second vertical, that is Akashvani, that is available through the TKS platform. The second vertical of Prasar Bharati, that is All India Radio, it was known as All India Radio, but now it is purely known as Akashvani. So we don't use AIR as a formal name. Of course, AIR started well something around early 1900. I would like to mention here that AIR was the only organization or service provider to the public using spectrum. And now, at that time, it was at will, it was available to Akashvani or All India Radio, and there was no competitor. Only radio was the medium through which wireless communication was reaching to the public. And now the situation is that we have to defend each and every spectrum what we can use. Not only radio channels, as Mahesh sir explained about the terrestrial thing, up to sub-gig band was only for the TV broadcasting, terrestrial TV broadcasting. Subsequently, it was allocated to mobile, and what we were able to get the services from the mobile communication. Here, I would like to mention that Akashvani is providing services in 23 languages and 179 dialects. That is huge. I want to mention about the spectrum from the radio regulation, Article 4.1, that states, member states shall endeavor to limit the number of frequencies and the spectrum used to the minimum essential to provide in a satisfactory manner the necessary services. To that end, they shall endeavor to apply the latest technological advances as soon as possible. That happened in all the areas of wireless usage. The technology is changing. It is almost utmost important for the policymaker to acknowledge that no one solution can fill the requirements. For example, terrestrial TV broadcasting, satellite TV broadcasting, and OTT services have their own advantages and disadvantages. Similarly, broadcasting, broadband, and satellite services have their own importance, catering to the various needs of the people. Here, when we talk about the spectrum allocation, we have to consider many aspects, apart from the commercial or monetization of the spectrum. Some of the key issues which need to be taken into account, that is digital divide among various classes. So we have to be very careful that we have to reach to the last person of this country so that he can utilize all the services and advantages. Similarly, we have a very clear divide between rural and urban. We have all kinds of services in the urban areas, whereas the same thing or similar things are not available in the rural areas. Why? Spectrum is the same. Same spectrum is available in rural areas as well, but we are not able to get the services. Why? So it is not the problem of spectrum, it is something else. So that needs to be taken care of. Similarly, we have our consideration about the commercial usage, societal usage, and strategic usage. These are the three main points which need to be balanced. What we have, I think topic is also that balanced mechanism for spectrum allocation. So here, these three considerations are important, not only the commercial thing. Then fourth and most important is the affordability to the new services or technologies for both the service providers and the consumer. So if we maximize the revenue from this spectrum, this may not be helpful in making it affordable to the consumer. So a balanced spectrum policy, which is both futuristic, sustainable, and provides legitimate protection to the incumbent services is the key. Here I want to stop right now, and we can discuss further as time permits. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rajeev, for pointing out the whole issue of digital inclusion as well as the importance of affordability even for a public broadcaster such as yourself. So this is very important, and we'll come back to that. May I now please request Laura to make her points. And Laura, of course, is the boss from Telesat.
I wish.
And has been frequently in India and has been, made some very, very important points in various fora that I've been in, and I've personally learned a lot from her. So Laura, all yours.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Dr. Uppal, and good afternoon, and thank you for being here and your attention to this exchange of ideas. So I would like to start my comments by highlighting, as it's already been done in another session this morning, the huge progress that has been done in the last few years in terms of regulatory developments in India by different governmental entities. So this is a very, very positive and welcome change and a huge step in what we consider, at least as a private satellite sector, the right direction. However, at the same time, as been already highlighted by my colleague, there are also mixed messages messages that are being conveyed, because on one side there is this huge emphasis and push towards satellite use and developments towards space, but on the other hand there is this that I would define perplexing idea of a possible auction of satellite spectrum, and I would like now shortly to explain why we find it perplexing. So first of all, my comments are pertinent to what is a commonly defined microwave range of the spectrum. So let's say broadly above 3 gigahertz, just to give a broad idea of the range that I'm referring to. In this frequency range, satellite operators can share spectrum among each other, and this is thanks to coordination procedures that are in place, thanks also to the radio regulations, and also physically because of the directivity of the antenna in these frequency bands. So in other words, the antenna is big enough for the beam to be small enough to be directive. This is not the case for terrestrial mobile operators, simply because the device that is being used, which is this, that we all have, as an omnidirectional antenna, is not directive. So in other words, so the implication is that terrestrial mobile operators do need an exclusive allocation of spectrum in order to be able to operate, while us as satellite operators we do not. So what would an auction do in this context? An auction would, by its own nature, give to a satellite operator only exclusive use of a certain portion of the spectrum. So what are the implications of this? So this would prevent what we normally do, which is effectively use the spectrum by sharing it among each other. And this, in our view, contravenes the basic principle of efficient spectrum sharing, because again, as has been mentioned several times, and also here, spectrum is a scarce resource. So other, now I'm losing the, I'm losing my train of thought. So this would also lead potentially also to, and also the scarcity of spectrum, the allocation of only a portion of spectrum, assuming an operator wins, would also have implication, of course, on the efficiency and the performance of the satellite system, because the satellite system is designed to use, for instance, the entire Ka band and not only a sub part of it. So that's another implication. And finally, as a last point, actually two more points. In an auction design, first of all, it is possible, or I would say most likely, that some satellite operators would be cut out, excluded entirely from the market because they do not manage to win any of the spectrum that could be put on auction. The other possibility is that the few winners, because there will be a limited number of winners, otherwise the auction itself doesn't make sense. This limited number of winners becomes, let's call them the gatekeepers of the spectrum, and they can decide which other operators can access the spectrum by coming to a private agreement with them as gatekeeper of the spectrum. As to come back to what Mr. Uppal was mentioning, Dr. Uppal, sorry, was mentioning before, this has clear implications on a non-transparency process, while the current administrative allocation is transparent by definition. Everybody can apply, and the DOT publishes the number of licenses that are being assigned. I would like also to mention briefly another issue that has been put forward as motivation for the auction by the terrestrial mobile operators. All this idea of the auction, in addition to the decision by the Supreme Court order, is also based on this hypothesis that satellite and terrestrial provide the same service, and therefore spectrum should be allocated in a similar manner and at a similar price. But is this really true? For instance, in a city like India, I don't see anybody walking around with a satellite dish, while each one of us has one of these. And why? Because by definition, terrestrial service provision, especially to end user on land, will only be in remote areas. There is no scope to buy a satellite dish if you live in an area that is well covered by terrestrial systems. On the other hand, satellite can provide services at sea, in the air, and that's not a direct, once again, it's not a direct competition with the terrestrial. As a final comment, it is clear that beside the sharing capabilities, that again are a physical difference, mobile operators sell to billions of customers, while the satellite industry, when it comes to connectivity provision, we are a niche market. There is no deny about that, because we fill in the gaps that are left by the satellite, by the terrestrial service provision. So this idea of competing on price on an equal basis between terrestrial, mobile and satellite, at least in our view, is just to put it as it is, nonsensical. But I would stop here, and I'm sure my colleague has much to add to this. Please.
Thank you.
Hazem.
Thank you.
Hazem is from Intelsat, and we've just met, but I've already been impressed by the few minutes I spent with him. So all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time being here with us. I think it's important also just to add to what my colleague said, to what Laura said. The court case that started all this, I think, is also taken out of context. That court case was specific to exclusive spectrum use. So the context of that court case was about exclusive spectrum use. It was not about every case of spectrum use. So I think this is a situation where a court case is being taken out of context for other motives that we don't know why. So it's important to set the record straight on that. The other point which I made earlier today is that there are different kinds of ways of how spectrum is used. There are cases where spectrum is shared and licensed, there's spectrum is shared and unlicensed, and there's exclusive spectrum, right? So the proponents of auctions are not talking about all shared spectrum. They're singling out satellite spectrum, and they're starting with a specific band. And I think it's driven by trying to exclude people from certain markets. It's less driven by transparency and more driven by perhaps competition, trying to push certain people out of certain markets. The third point is that every regulator is driven by, when they look at spectrum allocations, they're driven by three principles. Is that economic efficiency, maximizing competition, and maximizing societal well-being, welfare. Those are the objectives when regulators look at spectrum allocations. And when you do that, that doesn't mean that automatically takes you to auctions. Administrative spectrum allocation can also achieve these matters. I mean, I always like to take a look at the Wi-Fi option. Does Wi-Fi go through an auction? It doesn't. Medical devices, microwave ovens. Can you imagine that if the auction becomes the rule of the land, that everything has to go through an auction? These industries or these other uses of spectrum are not equipped to enter into any type of auction. So this mindset that auction is the metric or is the tool is I think is really misdirected, right? It's almost like when they say when all you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail, right? So you want to use the hammer on everything, and that doesn't work. When you look at all of these issues, and when you look at the fact that spectrum used by satellites, particularly above 3 gigahertz, is shared spectrum, and again, like I mentioned earlier today, even if you are to entertain the concept of designing an auction. You know, if you give the regulator here, tell them, okay, fine, auction satellite spectrum. Let's try to come up with an auction design that works. That's not going to end up being a failed auction. And because that's the worst nightmare for any regulators, to run an auction and the auction fails. This is really embarrassing for the regulator, for the government to have such a thing. So it's impossible to design an auction for shared spectrum, and an efficient or a meaningful auction when you are dealing with shared spectrum. So the one key issue here is that it would be practically impossible to come up with a reserve price. You know, you can't control the demand side. If you open the auction to everybody, I mean, let's say that you want to run an auction among satellite operators. Well, satellite operators can share. I mean, if you look at GEOs, for example, geostationary satellites, you can have a satellite every 2 degrees. So practically you can have 60 or 70 satellites serving India, right? So if you're going to auction that spectrum and you're going to say everybody's welcome, then what's the point? Because you could potentially accommodate 60 or 70 satellite operators. So the auction is essentially not serving any purpose. The flip side of it, if you say, well, I'm going to only allow a certain number of satellite operators to come in, let's say 5 or 6, then you are manipulating or distorting the market by limiting the competition. So you are saying, I like to use the analogies. It's like you have a dinner table that has 20 chairs on it, but you say, I'm going to only take 5. And the rest are going to stay empty. As a regulator, why would you do that? You know, because what you're doing here is that you are creating artificial scarcity. The ultimate result of this is that the prices are going to go up. The consumer is not going to have enough competition. And then it ends up being a lose-lose-lose proposition. So anyways, I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's a very important topic.
Thank you, Hazem. Thank you for describing and bringing to our notice the actual complexity of what a spectrum auction when it comes to satellite services is going to be, and also how counterproductive it could be in terms of encouraging competition or increasing affordability or reach. But we'll come to all that once more. But may I now request Bashir Patel from INMARSAT. He's joining us online. And Bashir also I've heard many times in various meetings, and I'm sure when you listen to him, you will discover a whole lot of new insights that I certainly have over the years. Thank you. Bashir. Are you there, Bashir?
Hello? Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Uppal, and thank you to the panel members, Rajeev. Quite interesting to hear the principles to which the government should take a more balanced approach. Both my colleagues Laura and Hazem has clearly outlined why not to auction satellite spectrum. But then let me also address the question, what is auction? Why auction itself? Why auction spectrum? Well, the fundamental reason why any government wishes to auction, and most governments around the world, particularly in the developing world, actually do not auction. They actually manage the spectrum administratively. They don't basically, they may have a beauty contest and they manage it administratively, but they don't auction. It's only the developed economies, which obviously see value in assigning exclusivity on the use of the spectrum for whatever 15, 20, even 30 years, given to a particular operator, mobile operator, to generate revenue. They auction a particular specific band of spectrum for their usage, either reached nationally or throughout the country and so on. So spectrum ownership is really the basis to which why any government wishes to auction. And that basically means you're giving exclusivity for that piece of spectrum, which is a very scarce resource, to be owned and used by that one single operator for n number of years. And that in itself begs the question, when you have a particularly spectrum that is internationally being used, such as satellite spectrum, and that is shared globally by multiple operators, whether there is a necessity actually to auction that piece of spectrum, which is shared by multiple users, as my colleagues pointed out. So there is actually no consensus among the mobile operators and their associations in terms of what is a fair value for their exclusive spectrum use. So calculating a value itself is also a challenge in itself. MNOs, mostly the mobile network operators, they tend to seek the lowest possible cost in ensuring reduced competition, okay, and minimize the risk of their entrants, new entrants. So they're really looking for more or less a monopoly or oligopoly kind of situation in that marketplace, which they're doing. And they obviously will strive to lower their costs, maximize their revenue, and stifle competition as much as possible. And this quite clearly is very much against government public policy. Given the mandate that the government has, as Rajeev pointed out, in terms of the principles of digital inclusion, sustainability, affordability, and a strategic nature, then you have to beg the question, is it really necessary to auction a specific piece of spectrum that is used by multiple satellite operators globally, and also providing and made substantial, significant level of investment of having space segment over the Indian subcontinent and providing services, some of which are very critical services used by both government and public. So that is the basis, why auction itself, simply to give the rights, exclusivity rights to mobile network operators. And I think you heard from my colleagues, why not to auction satellite spectrum? And I think there are a lot of reasons for it, and I think they've been pointed out by Laura as well as Hazem. But I think there are legal implications that needs to be carefully managed here, because when you have a piece of spectrum that is used by multiple operators, is shared globally, and this is the important aspect, then there are legal implications in terms of sovereignty of India. And then you have the neighbors, of course. There's a transborder use of that spectrum, because the satellite footprint and the beams cover not just India, but obviously it'll cover the neighboring countries as well. And the neighboring countries don't auction, or they will have that services available. So there are implications here from a legal point of view, transborder point of view, technical point of view, and economic point of view as well. All of these factors has to be carefully managed. And therefore they add to much greater level of complexity to the government and more headaches. If government wishes to have headaches, then fine. That would be a way. But quite honestly, it would not serve the public interest. So you need to manage the public interest based on the principle that Rajeev pointed out, by taking a much more balanced approach, whether to auction, particularly a spectrum that ITU and part of the radio regulations, which have identified this particular piece of spectrum to be shared globally, and it is being shared. And as I said, billions of dollars worth of space segment are there above Region 3 and over the Indian subcontinent that is serving communities and will cover communities in the future as well. So I think we have to be respectful of the level of commitment that is undertaken to serving India by both national and international operators, using the bands already. The satellites which are there, which cost several hundreds of millions of dollars, are committed in using that piece of spectrum for the next 10, 15 years during the lifetime of the satellite. So taking that spectrum away and auctioning it and making it exclusive use for a terrestrial operator would not serve the best public interest. And that is fundamental. We want to have digital inclusion. We want to serve every corner of India and every individual in the country. We want to make the services affordable. And of course, it's a strategic nature. If India has to have this vision of 2030 and 2048, 100 years of India's independence, then we need to be much more digitally inclusive and make sure that the service is there and competition is there, affordability is there to serve in the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Bashir. Thank you very much for bringing out the public policy angle, the legal angle, and also India's strategic interests angle. So that's extremely valuable. Maybe I can, I know we have about 15 minutes or 20 minutes. No. Yeah, about 17 minutes. So before, maybe I can ask a question each from our panelists and then open it to the audience. Or if you would like to start with some audience questions, we can come back to the panel to have final words. What would you prefer? Are there any questions at this point? And then we can. Yes. Gaurav, after that, you, sir, and Mr. Parwar after that. Thank you, Gaurav.
More than a question, just a clarification. I heard Bashir say, or alluding to the point which I wanted to clarify. Is there a situation in any country in the world where terrestrial spectrum is not auctioned and it is administratively managed? And if there is, can we get those examples as counter examples to the auction issues that we are facing here?
I'm sure that is the case, and we can certainly. Yeah.
So there are certain countries when the markets are not significant enough, where especially small island nations, where they assign spectrum to terrestrial operators without an auction because it doesn't make sense to go through an auction. But the auctioning of satellite spectrum, that has, for all intents and purposes, has never been done. There has been attempts to auction slots, and that failed miserably. But auctioning satellite spectrum while retaining it for satellite has never been done. So that would be a first. You know, one other point that I want to bring up, which is there were people who thought that the auction could be run where you bring in terrestrial and satellite together in the same auction, to have them enter the same auction and try to compete, right? And practically this is also impossible because, like I was saying before, reserve price issues are going to be, you can't design an auction that's going to work in that scenario. So.
You want to say something more? No. Thank you, Hazem. I think the whole issue of auction design is a larger question, and I completely agree with Hazem that it's a very complex issue when it comes to satellite spectrum. But maybe, Rajeev, I can ask you this first, in case you, as a public broadcaster, have a view on what it would mean to have spectrum auctioned.
First of all, I want to add that I think USA, Mexico, and Brazil, 3 countries, they tried to auction the satellite spectrum, and they failed. And for that reason, I think in India also, we have not enough reason for going for the option to the satellite spectrum. Apart from that, I want to emphasize that the incumbent services shall be well protected, and auctioning process may not exactly provide the real protection. I want to just put a question. Do you know when actually satellite was used for TV transmission or TV services? I think it is well beyond our imagination if I don't know. It was in 75 when even TV in normal sense was not popular. TV was get popularized after 82 ACR. And in 75, ISRO has planned with Doordarshan to have various receivers and uplink from one station so that the remotest areas can get the TV signals. So the incumbent services, what I meant to convey, they are from 75, and the public broadcaster is very much doing the service to the nation. And you'll be surprised to know that we have our DTH service, Gigi Free Dish. It has something around 50 million viewers, subscribers. And the pay TV subscriber on DTH platform is something around 65 million. So in that way, if we want to protect the incumbent services, it is very, very essential to consider, in my opinion, personal opinion, I'm not putting my official version because I'm a government officer and I cannot put my official version here. In my personal opinion, the administrative pricing method which is applicable now and being used effectively, that is very good sense and it should continue. I want to add one more point. Yeah, I want to add one more point that spectrum doesn't look like a commodity in a space segment. I think commodity is the arbitral position. Whatever arbitral position is there, that is need to be given to the service provider, and sharing of the spectrum is very much there in this space segment. And if I am not wrong, the one arbitral location can have 8 satellites. In present technologies, it can have 8 satellites at one location. So, considering all these things, I think we should consider for the orbital position to whom it is to be given, not the spectrum, because spectrum is associated with the orbital position and the satellite and the transponder. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And we'll come to Deepak after that, after you, sir, as Mr. Purwar, and then Deepak.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Prabhat. I work for Hughes Stick. My question is slightly related to the discussion we had on the day one while Mr. Hazem was there. So it's basically the with 5G NTN specifications now getting frozen, 3GPP is freezing it. The amalgamation of the terrestrial network and non-terrestrial network is going to be a reality. And the phones that we are holding now, those mass market phones are going to have satellite capability very soon. It's already having, iPhone 14 already has, but to the extent that is required that every phone will be able to contact to any satellite, that's going to be a reality very soon. So in that situation, the operators may allow operators may use the same frequency for terrestrial as well as for the satellite communication. So that can be a problem because of the interference. And the second question is that if there are multiple operators in the same region, and even if we stop them not to use the same terrestrial, non-terrestrial frequency, but the two different operators use the same satellite frequency, are you seeing it as a problem, or how it can be regulated? Do you see there is a technical challenge?
So thank you for your question. Maybe I can start with a preliminary reply to be complemented. But yes, there are these new services that will come to the market of direct satellite to handset communication. But this is not to be confused with what we mentioned before of satellite connectivity and sharing between satellite operators. And why? Because these new services, and I can mention a couple of companies because it's public news. One is Link, for instance. Another one is SpaceX with the next generation. The plan for this company is, as you also mentioned, to use exactly the same frequencies used by the terrestrial mobile operators, so that they've already been won at auctions by the terrestrial mobile operators. So this will require an agreement between the satellite operators wishing to provide these services and the terrestrial mobile operators. So there is no need of a new auction. In terms of interference, I don't know the details of this, but my understanding is that the service provision via satellite will be complementary to the terrestrial one. So in other words, the satellite will be like a base station in the sky, providing services in areas on the ground that are not covered by the terrestrial mobile, so more remote areas. So that they should avoid intra-system interference by these, possibly shaping the beams. Once again, I do not know the details. It is likely, I would say, and again, I don't know the details, that the data rate will not be too high because, again, directivity will be provided by huge antennas on the satellites. But there will be limitations, I guess, because, again, the handset is what it is, and its directivity cannot be improved. So that's my preliminary understanding, but please.
Sure. One really important point, because I've been hearing this theme, people are confusing NTN with the concept that satellite and mobile are becoming one. That's not the case. This does not mean that the two services are becoming fungible. I think a good example of what's happening is that the relationship between satellite and mobile has historically been symbiotic. Basically, we provide them cellular backhaul and they do their services. But increasingly, you see more integration in certain areas, but it doesn't mean that they are merging into a single service. That doesn't mean that suddenly now we're going to apply the same method for assigning spectrum. These NTN services are special cases in certain instances, in specific certain frequency bands. It doesn't mean that we can apply now the same regulatory mechanisms to assign spectrum. I think that's very important. As for the direct-to-handset question, just like my colleague Laura said, this comes in two flavors. It either comes as MSS service, and we all know how MSS operates. It operates within its own allocation, or it can happen using mobile spectrum. And in countries like in the US, where they are exploring the possibility of allowing this to happen, it requires an agreement from the MNO who won the auction so that you can augment their terrestrial service with satellite service. So it's call it complementary satellite component, just like there's a complementary ground component. This is now the opposite, complementary satellite component. So.
Thank you. Mr. Purwar.
Dr. Mahesh, in fact, I don't have a question, but I have a suggestion.
Okay.
The panel here is discussing the need of a proper mechanism for spectrum allocation and assignment. Now, it seems that the panel only has users of spectrum. We could have had somebody, a representative from the WPC in India, who could have heard your problems, would have explained his side of the story, and would have noted down the deficiencies that you have pointed out. That's only my suggestion. Yeah. I know whether you have any role in that or not.
Well, two things, Mr. Purwar. One, of course, the second question first, second suggestion first, I didn't have a role, but I'm quite sure that the organizers have wanted players, including the WPC here, but it's not for want of trying. It must be other difficulties. But I do acknowledge from you in what you're saying that it would be nice to also have some IMT users here also, and they could have given us a perspective and allowed a more engaged discussion on the issues, but that we didn't have much of a choice. But Deepak has a question. Keep it short, Deepak. We are committed to finishing in good time. Thank you.
Thank you. So just two things. One, you just mentioned about I think it should be we should be very clear whether we are using the term subscriber or the viewers. They're not the same.
Correct.
Okay. So second thing is, you also mentioned about in 1975, and it's appreciable that yes, at that point of time, we did start using the satellite for Doordarshan's expansion. But the fact is that was necessary, but it was not sufficient by itself. That's why from 1982 onwards, we had inauguration of a new transmitter almost every alternate day those days in 1982. And the third thing, as far as I know, the color broadcast started only in 1982 and not in 1975. Thank you.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. And I think you're absolutely right to bring the market component into it, that eventually a whole ecosystem has to be there, not simply just one particular technology. I hope I got your message right. And Laura, I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on one thing that you said. And by saying that the satellite players need access to the whole band and not to the bits, I understand you saying that in a way, auctioning spectrum for exclusive use will also be detrimental to satellite operations itself or satellite services. And it's I think, a very important point, and maybe you could elaborate on this for a bit.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, this can be seen in two ways. So there are possibly the most recent systems that are more flexible in terms of spectrum use, so they can really use spectrum, assign spectrum to beams depending on demand. But this flexible frequency assignment is also, and frequency reuse across beam is based on the assumption that there will be access to a certain amount of bandwidth. If that bandwidth is reduced, automatically the flexibility is reduced, the amount of spectrum that can be used is reduced, and therefore the data rate and the performance is reduced. However, some sort of service is still possible. It's even worse for possibly slightly older systems that still have a spot beam coverage, for instance, of India, but they have a fixed allocation of spectrum to each beam. So you can imagine, for instance, India covered by all small circles, and to each circles the system assigned this amount of spectrum. It's fixed in the satellite, it's hardwired, it cannot be changed. What happens if that satellite operator only wins a certain amount of spectrum? By definition, some of the beams of the circles covering India cannot be lit. They will be switched off completely. So rather than global coverage of the country, it will only be partial coverage. At that point, frankly, the service becomes completely useless, I would say. I hope that replies.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one additional comment. The sequence of how spectrum gets allocated, there's a process to it, and it starts at the ITU first, because there's first a decision before allocating the spectrum to X, Y, or Z. There's a question of what technology the spectrum is used for. So this is why there's a spectrum for broadcasting. There's a spectrum for radios. There's a spectrum for medical devices. And all of these designations happen at that stage. The issue of how spectrum is allocated within the country happens within the envelope of these definitions. And this is the purpose of harmonization of frequencies around the world. If you start to fragment, obviously every country can have its deviations from the ITU table of frequency allocations, but these deviations cannot be severe. Otherwise, there's no point of harmonization. It becomes to the detriment of all industries. There's a certain level of order that happens at the ITU level that trickles down to the administration. Then the administration can decide whether they want to allocate that spectrum by auction or by another method, or if they want to deviate a little bit from it. But that's the starting point, right? So if we end up in a situation where we want to use spectrum to determine which allocation we should give the spectrum to, I think we are doing it upside down, right? So for example, the spectrum that has been identified to mobile, that's already known at the ITU level, that this is a mobile band. Then it goes to the countries, and the countries run the auctions to decide who they're going to give it to. But we don't run an auction at the ITU to decide, should we allocate this satellite to space, or should we allocate it to radio, or should we, that's not the purpose of the auction. The auction is not used to determine the allocation. So, very important point.
Very important. Laura, you had an extra point.
Thank you. Just a very final remark, at least from me. So the issue of very important issue of harmonization has just been brought up because again, satellite by definition, by design, they are international or as a minimum multinational. Also, the point has already been mentioned that no other country in the world has ever auctioned spectrum in the microwaves for satellite use, because again, there are very good reasons for this. As a final question, as a food for thought, with the premise that India has full jurisdiction on its spectrum, so it can decide to do what it wants. It can do an auction if it so wishes. But again, as a question, what would happen if every country in the world, what would happen of satellite services if every country in the world would start auctioning spectrum for satellite? It's just something to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for those wise words. And I think it's rare to have a subject which has, on the one hand, international implications of the kind related to harmonization and various other things that both Hazem as well as Laura have pointed out. And on the other hand, implications for the really disadvantaged person who cannot currently be reached by terrestrial services, whether it's a remote user, a rural user who is waiting for years for services and all the rest of it. So here is something which has implications, as it were, for the last common person on the one hand, and international implications on the other hand. And I think whatever we decide to do, if it loses sight of either of those two, we would be making a grave mistake. So with that, I would like to thank my very able panelists, starting with Bashir. Thank you, Bashir, for joining us. Thank you, Hazem.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Rajeev. And thank you, SIA, for organizing this and giving me the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, dignitaries, and thank you, audience, for patiently listening and making it a successful event. Thank you, distinguished panelists and the chair. We will now head for the evening tea session. Now the tea session is happening only at the Oval area, Oval hall, the very first hall. Please kindly assemble there and you can have an interactive session there now. Thank you so much.